In the previous video, I talked about collusion with respect to price fixing. This is one of the main forms of collusion that firms in an oligopolistic market may engage in. But obviously there are other types of collusion that firms might engage in as well. These types of collusion, it should be borne in mind, are, in Australia at least, illegal. So you should be aware of that fact if you were thinking of trying to apply any of these kinds of strategies in the real world. There are serious legal consequences for engaging in this kind of nefarious behaviour. Anyway, one of the kinds of collusion that firms might engage in is bid rigging. This is where firms communicate with each other before they lodge bids and agree amongst themselves on who is going to win the bid and at what price. Normally this isn't a one-off thing, it's where there will be contracts from buyers coming in on a regular basis, and so the few firms who are in the market can form a secret agreement where they essentially divide the contracts between them. But they rig their bids so that each of the firms in the market gets an equal number of contracts. So for example, you might have firm A puts in a bid. Firm A and B get together secretly at Blacktown McDonald's and they hammer out an agreement where they say, okay, Firm A says to Firm B, okay, you can have this first contract which is coming out from, for example, the government for cardboard boxes. So what will happen is that Firm A will put in a bid for the contract, but they'll offer an insanely high, they'll quote an insanely high price, a price that's so high that there's no way they will win the contract. Then Firm B can put in a bid for merely a very high price, which will generate very large profits for that firm. That second firm, Firm B, will then win the contract because at least it's better than Firm A's insane offer, and will therefore make large profits. For the next contract that comes in, Firm A will be the nominated party to win that contract, and they'll perform the same activity as before. And this can go on and on and on while ever the secret agreement remains in place. Another kind of collusion is market sharing. This is where the firms in the market agree to divide the customers up between them. Sometimes this will involve dividing the customers up according to some kind of characteristics that the customers might have. So for example, you might have one firm that says, okay, our customers are going to be teenagers, and the other firms in the market won't try and poach that teenage market. Meanwhile, another firm in the market agrees to focus on adult customers, and both parties agree not to try and poach the adult customers. And so they divide up the market, for example, in that way. Another kind of collusion is where there is price signalling. This is where rivals disclose their future price changes that they're going to make to their so-called rivals for the purpose of lessening competition. That is, they give their rivals the heads up of what's going to happen with their prices, so that the rivals, so-called, are not surprised by that and can quickly then react, because they'll know ahead of time, react to one firm, for example, increasing its price by then matching that price increase. So the rivals are not taken by surprise, and so they don't lose customers. This, of course, implies that the firms involved have a good deal of trust that when one firm puts up its price and informs the others, discloses to the other firms that it's going to do that, that the other firms won't then say, here, let's cut our prices now and steal all of their customers. So there must be either some kind of explicit agreement or some kind of implicit trust that everyone knows what's in the best interests of the group, that is, to avoid a price war. And lucky last, we could have a case of collective bargaining and boycott. This is where firms which are ostensibly rivals act together as a block to, in inverted commas, blackmail lower prices from their suppliers. So it might be the case that you have a couple of dominant firms in the market who wish to acquire milk, for example, at a very low price, but they know that if they compete with each other to try and acquire milk, then the farmers can play the two firms off against each other and can hopefully get a higher price. But if the two firms who are potentially buying the milk act together to say, all right, we're not buying milk, neither of us are buying milk from you guys unless you offer a lower price, then in that case, the two firms can then, in that sense, blackmail the suppliers, force a lower price from their suppliers, and thereby decrease their costs. Now, does any of this nefarious behaviour occur in the real world, or is this just theoretical possibilities which are stamped out almost as soon as the thought arises by the law? Well, we know there are real cases of collusive behaviour that occurs. For example, Flight Centre was fined for attempting to fix prices on international fares, and you can see there that the opening paragraph of this article says the Federal Court has fined Flight Centre with trying to fix prices for international flights with 3 airlines in a ruling the travel agency says it may challenge. Flight Centre has been ordered to pay $11 million for trying to prevent Singapore Airlines, Emirates and Malaysian Airlines from offering cheaper flights than its own airfares between 2005 and 2009. Here's another example from overseas. In this case, we're talking about large tech companies who secretly work together to try and depress the wages of workers. So recently uncovered documents found that in 2005, Apple, Google, I think their motto is don't be evil or something. Anyway, Apple, Google, Intel, Adobe, Intuit and Pixar started a coordinated effort to push down their workers' wages. They agreed to not recruit employees from each other. They shared wage scales and they made sure to enforce their agreement with each other. As Apple's now dead Steve Jobs told Google's Sergey Brin, if you hire a single one of these people, that means war. Okay, so he's making a threat that the secret contract should, or the secret deal should be in place, otherwise it'll be bad news for everyone involved. Lucky last, in Australia, the most famous case of collusion was between the two cardboard box manufacturers who dominate the market in Australia. Visy is one company and Amcor is another company. It turns out that Visy and Amcor had a secret deal in which they engaged in price fixing and also in fixing bids for contracts. And as we can see there, billionaire Richard Pratt and his Visy group of companies have been fined a record $36 million for colluding in a price-fixing deal with their arch rival, which is Amcor, in Australia's cardboard industry. Incidentally, Richard Pratt has now died. And just as a side note, although Visy was fined $36 million, it has been estimated that due to their collusive behaviour in which they hiked up prices in order to make supernormal profits, they made approximately $350 million profit. So overall, we might say that breaking the law was in Visy's best interest. That is, it was rational for Visy and Amcor to break the law. They clearly made a profit by breaking the law. I suppose the side effect, which is not really a legal consequence, or strictly speaking a business or economic consequence, is that unfortunately for Richard Pratt, his public persona as a philanthropist, that is, someone who gave a lot of money to charity and was regarded as an excellent corporate citizen, was completely destroyed. So there were substantial costs personally to Richard Pratt that went beyond the fine of a measly $36 million. So let's sum up everything we have to say very, very briefly about the different kinds of market structures that we've looked at. First, perfect competition results in the long run in zero profits for all the firms in the markets. That doesn't mean that the entrepreneurs who run the businesses in a perfectly competitive market go home starving every night just because they make zero economic profits. Because remember, as part of the cost of production include the salary that entrepreneurs pay themselves, which renders it worthwhile running the business in the first place. So zero economic profits doesn't mean the entrepreneur starves. It simply means that the entrepreneur takes home the salary just necessary for them to continue to run the business. Compensation, just necessary for them to run the business, also known as normal profit. So, but nonetheless, because of that, there's always an incentive on the part of entrepreneurs who are out to make as much money as they can to find a way of escaping this situation of making zero profits in the long run. And one way in which firms can do that is they can try and differentiate their product from the crowd. They differentiate their product from the crowd, then they're producing a slightly different product from everyone else, and they will have their own little pocket or niche of consumers who are willing to pay perhaps a higher price for their product. Firms might also, in an attempt to generate economic profit, erect barriers to entry into the marketplace in order to try and turn themselves into a monopoly. However, if barriers fail, then the firms in the market will continue to face many competitors. Even if they're differentiating their product, new competitors can break into the market and steal customers from the firms which have sought to try and differentiate their product. That is, we may be looking at a monopolistically competitive market. Each firm is trying to produce its own slightly different product, but because there are no barriers to entry, all the firms in the end up breaking even nonetheless. And so there's a tendency to long-run zero profits. If, on the other hand, the barriers to entry are somewhat successful, then it's possible that only a few firms might survive in the market, in which case we'd be looking at an oligopoly. In the case of an oligopoly, where there are only a few competitors, competition may be fierce between them. That is, there may be price wars, there may be advertising wars, as each firm attempts to steal customers from the other. But that, in the end, can result in very low profits, even zero economic profits again. In this case, as we've seen in the previous videos, it provides an incentive on the part of the few rivals, the few firms in the market, to find ways of colluding with each other. That is, to agree to fix prices at a level that is higher than their average cost of production, so all of the firms in the market can break even, or finding other ways of colluding which can generate profits. But we should bear in mind that this is a risky business. Conspiracies against the public are illegal, and so it's always possible that the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, might start sniffing around if there's suspicious price behaviour going on in a market, and may discover that there is secret dealing going on, collusion going on, which can then result in prosecutions and large fines.